Actually, that was an excellent question that kind of segues into our definitions of different types of assessment. And let me just bring up this next slide and sort of talk about what formative assessment is. And the way that we've framed the whole concept of assessment is, you'll see this, sometimes you'll see it just broken down into formative versus summative assessment. We've added a diagnostic assessment part in here. So when you think about assessment for your students, you should really think about these three different types of assessment, and they're really quite different goals for all of these. Formative assessment, think about it as empowering the students, gives them the tools and knowledge to improve. So there was an immediacy to those Blackboard quizzes. The faculty member is not involved. The student is assessing their own performance and then using what they've learned in that immediate moment to improve their performance, improve their understanding. Diagnostic assessment, faculty members do this all the time, right? You'll take a look and see, okay, how many people know this concept? And by a show of hands, you see, oh, not very many people know that. That tells me something as the instructor about how I need to change the way that I'm doing things so that they can learn better, right? So it helps me identify problems that I'm then going to try to modify in the class that I'm teaching. And summative assessment is really what people think about when they think about assessment, and that's sort of the one bite at the apple that you were talking about, right? Where I really need to see what my students got on this quiz because I need to give them a grade. So try to keep these different concepts of assessments in mind, and you have a nice little icon for each of those, so you know that they're a little bit different. Any questions about the types of assessments that you guys are using? Okay. Okay, so one thing that I hope that people keep in mind when they're thinking about formative assessment is this concept of the teachable moment. And this dates back way from 1952. Robert Havighurst in Human Development and Education. He says, when the timing is right, the ability to learn a particular task will be possible. This is referred to as a teachable moment, right? Everyone's heard of the teachable moment. Let's think about that in terms of assessment and how formative assessment can actually take advantage of that teachable moment. Unless the time is right, learning will not occur. When a student's teachable moment occurs, she or he can benefit from the knowledge. So just keep that concept of the teachable moment in your head. And we'll talk about a couple of the most recent research studies that actually have looked at formative assessment. So formative assessment, why do we want it? So I didn't want this to float in, so I'm going to float the whole thing in. All right. So in this particular paper in 2013, this was a study that showed that there was a positive effect on student success when given formative quizzes. And Maya Kukushik and Zelio Garasha and Mario Jadrik, probably pronounced all of them improperly, talk about this moment of learning, which captures the teachable moment, as we saw teachable moment before, to reduce the gap between what the student knows and what we want them to know. So that's another thing that I like to keep in mind when I'm thinking about formative assessment. We've got the students, and we're trying to teach them this thing, whatever it is. And if you imagine that there are these converging lines, what they know, what we want them to know, and how do we implement formative assessment to close that gap, to make that gap smaller. And then they talk about the effectiveness of online self-assessment tools, that they should be formative in nature, that they reduce some instructor load, which is great because if you don't have to assess the students, if the students are assessing themselves, they're improving without you. And you know, I've graded so many English papers, and you know, you're checking their grammar and you're fixing their sentence structure, and you're telling them that they need a thesis, and then you give them a grade and you hand it back, right? What kind of assessment is that? That's a summative assessment that you're pretending is a formative assessment, right? Because you're giving them all of this information that you're hoping they learn from, but how much are they actually getting from it? Because they're looking at that final grade and that's it. They're not going back and seeing, oh, I have a run-on sentence here. So that will reduce some instructor load. Some of this provides instant feedback. So we're going to talk about two different kinds of assessment, right? So two different kinds of formative assessment that our faculty members are talking about. Jordan's was more of an instant feedback kind of a thing. And we're going to have Jim Ulver talking about how reflection can actually create this formative assessment piece. And then students become less dependent on instructors because they actually are developing the knowledge themselves. And the second paper, which is a really good one, it has a long title there at the bottom. You can see how long the title is. Also from 2013, Minjiang Kim and Jihyun Ryu. They did a study where they found that web-based formative peer assessment improves performance over traditional peer assessment, which was actually summative peer assessment, so I'm not sure how valuable that was, but also self-assessment. So giving students the opportunity to do peer assessments, actually, if they're formative assessment, if they're created as a formative assessment, improves performance better than peer assessments that are summative and self-assessments that are formative. So that's something important to keep in mind. And they build on Sadler. And Sadler, I have a quote here from him because it's really excellent. Formative assessment mandates that learners have awareness of the learning goal, right? So it's really important, and we've been mentioning this a lot in our e-learning communications with folks, is that first we have to be explicit about what the students need to learn, what we're asking them to learn. The ability to compare the actual and desired performance. So again, we're talking about that sort of converging line, right? And then the ability to act in such a way as to close the gap. So how do we do it? Assignment types that might offer opportunities for formative assessment. What do you guys think? What are some assignments that you think, oh, the students could really learn from what it is that they are learning by doing and then having an opportunity to redo? What sorts of assignments do you guys offer that are formative in nature? Yeah.
I think this is kind of a tricky question. I can think of a lot of different assignments, homework, final project, whatever, that depending on a number of parameters, how the students perceive it, is it graded or is it for their information, could fall in either category. So,
right.
For example, in the class I'm teaching now, a smaller seminar-ish class on physical chemistry for biological systems, they're doing this big infographic project as their final exam. And we're doing this interim draft of the project they have to submit. It's going through peer review within the class. There are no points associated with that other than just completion. We've got a rubric set up so they can then see, exactly what is expected, where do they fall on that based on my input, based on their peer input, and then they have a chance to modify it and resubmit. So I think in that sense, it's very formative. But I also think of many of our homework assignments, I don't actually give very much weight to homework, even though they all very enthusiastically complete them, which is great. But my intent behind the homework is not to assess whether they understood the material so much as these are ways that you need to see what you're missing, where are the gaps, and how can you prepare for final exams, which are active substance. So I think there's kind of like a spectrum.
And that's a great point, because that's why I put specifically here assignment types that might offer opportunities for formative assessment, right? Because so many assignment types can be used in a way that makes it more summative, in a way that makes it more formative, in a way that makes it more diagnostic. So for the faculty member to have that idea in their head, is my student getting immediate feedback and then being asked to do something again, right? If not, it may not be so strong in formative assessment. Is my student given opportunity to reflect on what it is that they did in class? If not, it may not be formative assessment, right? Anybody else? Yeah.
I was just wondering, for the peer performed assessment, I was just wondering who's actually learning more on that end? Is the one who does the assessment or who receives it?
That's a great question, and that also so much depends on how it's constructed, right? Because if you're asking the student to be the teacher who's actually doing that peer evaluation, then the peer who's doing the teaching learns something valuable. If you're asking the student who's receiving that information, who's receiving the peer feedback, to then act on it in a way that improves their knowledge, their performance, then both things are possible, right? It really, and that's why constructing these assignments is really the devil is in the details when you're talking about formative assessment.
Peter, that is a great question. If you recall back to the student that we interviewed about Piazza last month, she actually made this point wonderfully. She said, oh, when one of my peers would ask a question, and I thought, oh, I can answer that. And she started to do it, she'd think, oh, wait, do I really know the answer to this? So that self-reflection of providing the peer assessment can actually be a formative event, an important formative event, because in having to explain something, it has to be really clear in your mind. And we're all familiar with that, right? So it's different to sort of think that you understand the concept to be able to clearly explain it. So that peer, giving that peer feedback from both ends can be very formative.
So here are just a few of the possible things that we came up with that might possibly offer opportunities for formative assessment. The way that you construct that assignment is really going to be key. But free writing, science labs, case studies, Socratic dialogues for sure, and then peer discussion and problem solving, right? And then some characteristics of formative assessment. Self-evaluation is really critical. Micro assignments where they're getting feedback automatically is really important. Peer review really helps. Instant feedback. And the theoretical made concrete. So if they're given the opportunity to learn a concept and then given that opportunity to give an example, to develop an example, that really helps with formative assessment. And then, of course, this is the key. Students have the chance to revise their work.